turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Oh, hi.
Bonjour, hello.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm alive. No, I'm currently in the middle of writing a chapter, and it's one of those things where, like, I know things, but, like, putting it together, I can't do that. And I'd rather just watch season 1 or series 1 of Traitors.
Excellent choice. It's also hard because my biggest issue was I knew what to say, I just couldn't make it coherent for anybody else. So I kept sending them stuff, and they were like interesting points, but there's nothing joining anything together. And I was like,
No, that's where I think I'm a lot better writing for a conference or setting up a talk, because I like dumbing things down to its basicness. Having to explain my thoughts and having to prove it with citations, I can't. I just want to be like, trust me, I know what I'm talking about.
Trust me, I'm right.
Especially, so the current section I'm writing, I have this knowledge from, like, years ago. So I'm like, do I have to cite this? I just know it.
Yeah, and this is the first episode we're recording for season 3, even though I think this is like the 10th episode. So enjoy that when it comes to it. But yeah, this is the first episode we're recording because lots of our other episodes involve guests, so we have to like work around guests, and this was the easiest to do in the time we had. So we're recording like mid-August.
Yeah, so right now we are post-Olympics. Or at least Hannah is about to go off and do a 3-country tour for her conferences. I'm about to go cat sit. So we're both thriving. So you're catching us at a moment in which we're traveling girlies. And what better to travel with than to talk about phenomenology, a word that I still cannot say properly.
So yeah, welcome to Theoryish. Hi. I haven't told Paula we're doing this, but I think it's better to be like, I'm Hannah, hi, and the other person is Paula. Because I don't think we ever do that in any of our episodes.
I mean, our voices are so distinct that if you're mixing up our voices, I think you need to go to the doctor.
Yeah, true. If you know us. But if you're tuning in for the first time, that's who we are. So as part of our podcast, we occasionally have episodes in which we introduce a wider idea or concept. Unlike the rest of our podcast, these are episodes in which both myself and Paula take time to script to help kind of keep us on track. So far we've done an episode on queer theory, post-structuralism, intersectionality, and we really recommend these episodes to anyone who might be interested in the subject matter, or to those who want an introductory source for their students, friends, family, or loved ones, or themselves. So we actually host the podcast through Spotify, primarily because it's free. Spotify has a feature that allows us to post polls for people to vote through. And last season we had a poll regarding which introduction to you wanted for this season. And this won by a small margin of 42%. So introduction to phenomenology, here we go. I hope I'm saying it right.
I am never going to say it right. So I have certain like vocal stuff that I cannot do properly. So if you are annoyed by this, I'm so sorry. English is still technically my second language. So, suck it. But most importantly, usually take turns. One of us does the most for an intro too, and then the other, and we switch around. So this one is Hannah's baby, because I know nothing about phenomenology.
Yeah, I use a bit of phenomenology in my work. I mostly use Sara Ahmed, and I will be talking about Sara Ahmed later because I think that is a useful thing to ground this discussion because of the introduction twos we've done before, but also the other topics that we've covered in the seasons. But the other thing I wanted to say before we move on is that we will have a poll probably underneath this episode. So if you're not on Spotify but have Spotify, you can just click into the episode and it'll be in like under the description.
And if you really want a specific subject that is not on the poll, feel free to either DM us on social media, or at the end of this episode, we include not just our handles, but also our email.
I want to preface this episode by saying that phenomenology is a very philosophically dense topic. We're not philosophers. I am now sociologist / sort of historian, and Paula is historian / art historian. And so, like, this is not our specialized area of expertise. And so, and for all the philosophers who are actually listening, we will primarily be covering Edmund Husserl's conception of phenomenology, though I will mention other people. But just to let you know, because there's a lot of disagreement and all that kind of stuff, what we will give you instead is an entry point into phenomenology, because I think it's one of those topics that, again, is very dense. It relies on older forms of philosophy. I say older, not that much older, but it feels older. Older forms of philosophy. It relies very heavily on loads of different conversations that have taken place over time. And so I won't be covering every and all of those conversations, but what I want to give you is an entry point into that, so that if you want to take this further, or you just want to understand what people are talking about when they talk about phenomenology, that's what this episode will give you. I also hope that you get from this episode that lots of phenomenology underpins really important and influential theory, including lots of theories that we've already covered, and it has tangential connections to other people. Like, yeah, I'll mention some of them as we go through, but yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If there's anything I've missed or is a really key point that you think should be discussed, you can always email, always DM. We prefer email. So yeah, if you want to email, that is something you can do. As always, this is obviously not information that comes directly from me. It's kind of an amalgamation of everything I've read, like all academic work. So there's going to be a link in the description to a Google document with links to source material that I've either drawn from directly to discuss this topic, or that will elaborate on what I've kind of said here. And I'll include hopefully some links to the original text, so you know where to go if that is something you're interested in. So, Pally, you've already said you know nothing about phenomenology.
That is correct.
If you were to guess, what would you think it would be about?
So, because I've read a lot of philosophy that sort of skirts around phenomenology, I think it's more about like a transcendental existence, or something that is, I don't know how to even explain it. It's something almost ethereal in a way. I'm going mostly off of when we read some works by Sara Ahmed, and how these things are sort of like remnants of passing, and you know, in other words, I don't know. But I feel like it's something that is sort of beyond grasp, or something that like just slips away from your fingertips, and sort of that sort of sensation and feeling, but obviously expanded through philosophy and theory.
I'm impressed. You got to the transcendentalism, which is actually a part of it. I'm very impressed.
My IQ is unstoppable and unbeatable.
So as Paula's saying, like, it's very abstract, but it's also not. it's really hard to explain, which is why I'm including at the end a discussion of Sara Ahmed, because I think Sara Ahmed gives a more concrete way of understanding phenomenology without necessarily you having to do too much background work, right? Like, I understood Sara Ahmed's points without having to read Husserl when I originally read Sara Ahmed. That's what I mean by that. So a simplistic understanding of phenomenology is that it's primarily occupied with the ways in which a person or people experiences the world around them. Very vague, I know. But in essence, they really are interested in how phenomena is consciously, and this consciousness is a very key aspect, is consciously experienced. So phenomena here refers to the Greek word for appearances. So phenomenology is a way of seeing the world rather than a set of doctrines or theories. So some take phenomenology further, discussing how phenomenon shapes the unfolding of experience. It's really important to note here that phenomenology is not phenomenalism. This came up quite a lot. So phenomenology is very specific, and it's not simply a type of qualitative description of an individual's subjective experience. So description does factor into phenomenology, but it is beyond that, right? It is really focused on this consciousness. It's also, if you're following Husserl, focus on this transcendentalism, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it goes beyond this. It provides detailed, grounded, well-crafted descriptions of individual subjective experiences. So often it's not just one person's. Some phenomenologists define phenomenology as a method rather than a specific theory or a theoretical lens. So phenomenology often asks that we push aside these doctrines and theories, including scientific theories, as phenomenologists feel that we can gain insight into the world if only we reduce or remove our preconceptions. So this is because phenomenology really is interested in what happens when things like emotions, consciousness, senses, and the world come into contact, although it's not limited to sensory experiences. Important to mention that the reason for this is that phenomenology is, quote, guided by what is actually given rather than what we expect to find, end quote. Essentially, you begin from the point of experience rather than the point of theory. You don't go into a phenomenological study with an idea of what you expect to find. Take it as it comes, basically. So consciousness is not necessarily the object of study, even though it's important, but what consciousness reveals about the world around us is the thing you're focusing on. So Sean Gallagher, who wrote a book on phenomenology, which I think is really, really helpful, I'll include it in the description, says that consciousness is very purposeful. If you exist in the world, you have knowledge of that world consciously. You're aware of the world around you. That might differ from person to person. That is also important. But for example, if Gallagher gives the examples of if you're standing by the side of the road and you're waiting to cross the road, you're very aware of things like the cars moving, the road itself, how long it might take you to cross that road, what might happen if you don't cross the road safely, things like that, right?
I was going to say, this is probably why I think I had a little bit of an understanding for the definition, because a lot of contemporary art actually uses things like phenomenology to, we can put this either in the beginning or the end, but I thought specifically of an art piece called Washing Away Wrongs by Annika Yee from 2014. And it's a set of washer and dryers. When you open it up, you can smell different smells. And it was the artist's interpretation of that piece, or like what they associate with washers and dryers. So it's sort of taking in that like ideas of experience and ideas of environment and ideas of all these like subconscious sensations of a singular object or event, and then being able to replicate it in a way that is nonsensical almost.
Yeah. And that's a really useful example, actually, and shows that maybe I do sort of know what I'm talking about here, because like you're managing to get the general gist, right? And and I would be very surprised if phenomenology did not appear in art history. It seems to have appeared in almost every discipline, right? Yeah, so consciousness then is intentional. It's our window onto the world. Again, this comes from Sean Gallagher. He says that before we metaphorically can look through a window, for example, we should be concerned with the condition of the window. And the beginning of phenomenological research should consist of understanding the conditions imposed on consciousness. So you are also an active participant in understanding phenomenology. Sean Gallagher says, quote, "The phenomenologist thinks that the first step in understanding the basis for knowledge is to study the conditions imposed by consciousness, the way it works, and specifically the structural features of consciousness, and perhaps the systematic distortions that might introduce some kind of bias." So that is briefly, in a nutshell, what phenomenology is.
It is one of those things that I didn't realize I had already experienced through pieces of art, but like now that we're putting it to words, and then like it's also kind of where I had difficulty with Sara Ahmed at the beginning, especially when we recorded on her essay during our first season, but now it's starting to all sort of come together a lot better. Yeah, so please continue. I want to learn more.
It's really interesting, and like I think also based on what we've already read, but also based on what I know you study, what I also study, I think we're particularly attuned to understanding phenomenology. It's really interesting because I think when you have phenomenology in front of you, it's really hard to get into if you're not used to that way of thinking. But once you do, you're like, oh, I will know it when I see it.
I can also see the difficulty of utilizing this in academic circles because it is something like, how do you describe touch? You know, you can describe how certain things can feel sticky or soft, but how do you describe the touch of touch? So it's one of those things where how do we then translate it into histories where, you know, you're talking about things like history of emotions, where it's really hard to pin it down. And that's why anyone that's doing history of emotions is incredibly intelligent, because being able to not just figure out what's being felt, but how to describe it and concisely state it. And I think this is a really difficult thing to understand and a really difficult thing to apply. So I think art is like the easiest way I could possibly describe it.
Some key terms, and these are not all the terms, right? Because there's so much and there's so many different words used. But these are the ones I saw over and over again, and that I actually think it's very needed to be able to understand phenomenology, at least where it came from. So these quotes or sections of text I'm using are from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, because they actually have a very useful list of all the keywords. So I'm going to try and put it into my own words, but these are kind of what they're saying. So the first keyword I have is epoch. And this is the main methodological device of phenomenology. It's your way of putting yourself into that phenomenological frame of mind. So you have to, and this is very difficult, I imagine, you have to suspend or prevent your natural way of understanding the world and what they say in the University of Massachusetts kind of thing. They say you have to put out your naive assurance that the world and its objects exist, which is very wild, right?
Well, it's kind of like when you're watching a animated movie and, you know, there's a person flying. You have to suspend belief. You have to forget that gravity exists. You know, I don't know, maybe it's especially us two, you as like a video game person and me as like a young fiction fan. You sort of have to learn how to do this in order to enjoy what it is you're consuming. You know, like, we know that if you run between platforms 9 and 10, you're gonna, like, be hit with a wall. But you have to suspend this belief in order to, like, enjoy the thing. I get it.
And so instead of saying that the world exists or does not exist, you kind of take a position in between. You say either or, neither, right? And so once we're kind of in this epoch, this space in between, it feels like we explore the spatiotemporal world from within that place. Another key phrase is bracketing, right? So you suspend, you set aside your biases, your everyday understandings, theories, beliefs, modes of thought, judgments, and if you bracket the world, that's how you enact the epoch. That's how you enter that space, right? Bracketing is very contentious from what I understand. I'll talk a little bit about it later because some people claim that that is absolutely impossible to do, and it's bizarre that you can say that is a thing. Or like, I'll talk a bit more about it with Sara Ahmed, but Sara Ahmed has a very useful critique of this.
Yeah, which I think I'm leaning more towards even before we do before we do this consensus or this discussion. I meant.
There's also the idea of the reduction. So the epoch is part of a larger movement of phenomenological or transcendental reduction. So you reduce your description to what is immanent to the transcendental ego. Put a pin in that for a second. And you leave aside all descriptions and explanations that come from everyday life, the positive sciences, and the historical, cultural surroundings. So, you know, when I was saying leave your kind of theories at the door, leave your discourse at the door, right? You enter truly in this space of, feels like meditation, but not really, because meditation is also a thing. But transcendental philosophy is really all about the possibility for experience. So things that show up or appear to a person. Phenomenology is considered a type of transcendental philosophy because it's really interested in the possibility of things showing up for a person. And basically, Husserl followed Kant by proposing that a transcendental approach was the way into this epoch, into this bracketing, this ability to bracket things. And yeah, does that make sense? It's very complicated.
It's sort of like a pyramid, but like inverse. So it's like broad and then it shortens and shortens and shortens and it gets more and more specific. I'm very happy that we did Freud before this. I think there is a thread that is connecting all of these things together. And I think the complications that come from beyond the pleasure principle are sort of being continued in this. So does it make it easier? No. But I think our brains were sort of molded and prepared to sort of take this in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If you have an epoch, you have something called a life world. So Husserl introduced this concept in 1936. It's the idea of the taken for granted world we live in and experience. It seems simple, but it is a term that comes up a lot. And I think if you heard that, you might have a preconceived notion of what it is. It's connected to this idea of if you bracket the part of the life world, you end up with the epoch. Does that make sense?
You say it's simple. I'm going to be with the listeners right now. It is not simple.
It's not. I think I've just been reading it for the past week and I've been like, all of this makes sense.
Well, I also saw it like in German within our script and like Lebenswelt. And it's just like, this sounds Germanish for sure.
Yeah, this is German. We're going to talk about the history in the next part. We'll also talk about Freud a little bit. So the last term that I have that comes up a lot is this notion of intentionality. So the idea of the consciousness, you're intentionally being conscious about something. So University of Massachusetts puts it as when you judge something, you judge something. When you think about something, you're thinking about something. When you perceive something, you perceive something. Imagine, you're imagining something. When you desire something, you desire something, etc., infinitum. So when you have a mental act, you're intentionally doing that mental act. It's very interesting when we, I guess, compare with Freud. I wouldn't know enough to say about it, but Freud also has this notion of consciousness, but also subconsciousness.
And also given the time period this is being crafted, there's also the esotericness of this type of thing, because it almost sounds like manifestation. And, because this will be in a whole nother episode, but there is that esoteric movement that's running concurrent to this, or at least at the ends of it, where it is sort of this language being put forth more academically. But I think it's a hodgepodge of a lot of things that are going on.
Yes, yeah. And it gets even more confusing. But we won't go too much into that, right? Like, this is what I mean by this is an introduction to these things. Now you have these words, these phrases. You can recognize them in what people are saying. You can dive deeper, but you don't have to, right? Those are the terms. That's the overview of phenomenology. But I want to take you through the history because I think the history is interesting.
Take me through it.
As somebody trained in history, I love it. So Edmund Husserl is an Austrian-German philosopher and mathematician. Interesting.
Of course he is.
Yeah, of course. He's considered the founder of phenomenology. That were people who influenced him. I'll talk a little bit about that. But he was born in 1859. He died in 1938. And he wrote extensively about phenomenology throughout his life. This idea developed gradually, and he loved to change his mind. He loved it. He loved to write about something and then be like, I think I'm wrong, actually. A bit like Foucault. Foucault loved to change his mind. If you think about something enough, you can think yourself out of it.
Honestly, goals.
So even though Husserl was trained as a mathematician, he was influenced by somebody called Franz Brentano, a German philosopher and psychologist whose descriptive forms of psychology resonated with Husserl. Brentano was also influential on Sigmund Freud, who we covered last season, and hence the connection. So they're stemming from a very similar place, almost the same place, some might say. So Husserl wrote an absolutely enormous amount throughout his life, and his manuscripts, which were written in shorthand, contained 58,000 pages. These were smuggled out of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, as Husserl was Jewish, family was Jewish, and these are now kept in Belgium in the Husserl archives, which is great.
58,000 pages in shorthand?
I think some people have read a lot of that as well, because from what I was reading, people were like, in the original document, I was like, oh my god.
Could not be me.
So alongside Husserl, another key figure in phenomenological thinking is Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher known for phenomenology, hermeneutics, and existentialism. He was a pupil and then colleague of Husserl. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party after Husserl was prohibited from teaching at the University of Freiburg due to his Jewish background. So as German phenomenologists fled Germany to the Nazi regime, they've spread phenomenological thinking to places like France and the United States.
For sure, we are going to discuss Heidegger in the future. You kind of can't avoid him. He is like the little Nazi boogeyman to contemporary philosophy and theory. He really is. He's an interesting character, for sure. But because this is mostly focused on phenomenology, we want to sort of just limit Heidegger to this. So if you want us to cover Heidegger next season, please let us know. We will hold you accountable.
Yeah, we could cover Heidegger some more. We will definitely also cover more of the history of him and his entrance into the Nazi Party and his defense of that entrance.
He's a messy girl.
Messy. But he's also a key figure. When you hear Husserl, usually you'll hear Heidegger. Key point to make here is that Heidegger also disagreed a little bit with Husserl's idea of phenomenology. He starts to change it. It's mostly around, I think, the idea of being. I will not go into it, though. That's where you start to get very complicated in the ways people disagree with each other. It's a lot. But the book I mentioned earlier, the Sean Gallagher's book, does this in a lot of detail. So go read that book if you want to know more. Other early key figures in phenomenology include Max Scheler, a German philosopher who's known for phenomenology, ethics, and philosophical anthropology. Karl Jaspers, German, Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher who's influential in theology, psychiatry, and philosophy. Edith Stein, German philosopher who ended up converting to Catholicism and becoming a nun. Her life was actually kind of crazy. You should look that up. Wild. And Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher who's best known for the book Truth and Method, a work on hermeneutics. So as you can see from all of these individuals, phenomenology has a very close connection to hermeneutics, the theory and methodology of interpretation that focuses on biblical and philosophical texts, as well as existentialism, philosophy that aims on exploring the issue of human existence characterized by a focus on dread, anxiety, and how life has no reason or meaning behind it.
Where's Igor?
Yeah, I know. I wrote in in the notes that it might be worth commenting, I guess, on the connection to religion, but also this notion of existentialism. Kierkegaard, where you at? All of these individuals, by the way, build on phenomenology, but also disagree. So you'll see, like, one person will say something, but they also disagree. They're trying to, like, make their mark in phenomenology. What is also important, I guess, to mention is that these people are still invested in the idea of phenomenology, but that doesn't mean they don't disagree with the way it's being done.
And I think it's more succinct than, let's say, our post-structuralists that were just countering themselves. So they were not even in agreement with each other. This one has at least a much tighter connection between each other.
So individuals who took up phenomenology after Husserl include Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who I would love to discuss, by the way. Super interesting. Writes really well. I love it. This is a French philosopher who's highly influenced by both Husserl and Heidegger. He wrote on all manner of topics, including perception, art, politics, religion, biology, psychology. He's written on it, basically. He also founded a magazine with two other individuals who are highly influential in phenomenology, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Sartre was a French philosopher and playwright, also did many, many other things, but is a key figure in French philosophy and Marxist thought. He also has connections to existentialism, and Simone de Beauvoir was a French existentialist philosopher, social theorist, and feminist activist who you actually may have heard her name in relation to the massively influential book, The Second Sex. So other people involved, Aaron Gershwitz, who was a Lithuanian Jewish American phenomenologist, and Alfred Schutz was an Austrian philosopher whose work connected phenomenology and sociological thinking, which actually I think you can see a lot of sociological or like phenomenology in sociology, in the way sociology is done and thought about and envisioned. It also, obviously, because of the psychological kind of underpinning of phenomenology, it has a lot of connections to psychiatry. But one of the reasons that phenomenology is really hard to pin down is because it can be really done in any discipline in many, many different methodological ways. Like, it's not that it's just a qualitative thing, it's also a quantitative thing. It can be done many ways, many. So after being spread to America, American scholars really, really went wild. They published papers, they arranged conferences, they founded societies. This was all in the 1960s. They were loving it. During this time, though, European academics began to reject phenomenology. So as it's going up in America, in Europe, they're like, no. In part due to Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher who was originally inspired by phenomenology and existentialism. It's really interesting. He's very inspired by it, but then starts being like, ew, I hate it.
It's why I love him.
He was like, ew, I hate this.
Crusty.
Yeah. He begins to critique Husserl and Heidegger and argued that actually phenomenology is a form of metaphysics. Now, phenomenologists don't like this. I get the vibe that they don't like this. Or they'll say, oh, that kind of phenomenology is metaphysics, but not mine. It's very dramatic. It's very complicated. I'll leave some sources in the description. But essentially, he saw, as in Derrida saw phenomenology as privileging a certain kind of voice that was only in dialogue with itself in order to achieve a perfect kind of self-presence that necessarily doesn't exist. So essentially, phenomenology could not claim some kind of neutrality that it tries to. It tries to claim that there is a way you can enter into this neutral, separated kind of thing, but that's not necessarily the case.
So a big reason why Jacques Derrida was probably also saying all these things and like picking fights is because at this moment in time was the Algerian War, or also known as the Algerian War for Independence, which took place between 1954 to 1962. And Jacques Derrida, being an Algerian person, was probably looking around and being like, what neutrality? Is neutrality in the room with us right now?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So he had valid reasons for being like, what are you lot doing? So Despite all of this, Americans were very fascinated with phenomenology up until the late 1970s. In 1980s, however, post-structuralism becomes a more popular theoretical viewpoint. Phenomenology actually gets revived in the 1990s, particularly in connection with cognitive sciences, most likely due to the psychological roots of phenomenology and phenomenology's focus on consciousness. So that's the kind of history of it. And I'm going to go over some of the critiques, but I'm not going to lie. The critiques required a very in-depth philosophical knowledge of phenomenology. And so I was reading post-structuralism and I was like, we're not doing that. and so I'm going to briefly mention the ones I saw and understood, but just know there are like a lot out there. And you could read Derrida's own piece, for example, of like reasons why he didn't vibe with it. So, post-structuralism, which Paula outlined in more detail last season, briefly, is a philosophical movement that questions the objectivity or stability of interpretive structures and is broadly connected to analyzing systems of power. Grew out of 1960s France. Both Husserl and Heidegger actually influenced post-structuralism a great deal. Despite this, with the rise of post-structuralism came the increasing critiques of phenomenological thinking. Paula, do you think you can think of possible critiques from a post-structuralist standpoint?
Well, immediately the first thing I thought of was this supposed neutrality and ability to have an unbiased view of a singular thing, which is certainly not true to me. I'm sure someone out there who's smarter and much more eloquent with their words is able to, dance rings around this statement. But I think people have been conditioned to be biased and to react in certain ways, and you cannot avoid natural instinctual, I don't want to say natural or instinctual, but like knee-jerk reactions.
That does make sense, because one thing I guess I haven't said is that naturalism is like throughout, is connected to it.
Well, it's like, if you hit me in the knee, I'm gonna kick. It's an involuntary reaction, whether it is positive or negative. And in addition to that, it's sort of like the critique that we currently have for people who say they don't see color. It's one of those things. Yes, you do.
Yeah. So basically, we're not going to cover it in a whole lot of detail in this episode, but phenomenology eventually gets taken up in a form of like critical phenomenology, which I would say Sara Ahmed is connected to. Frantz Fanon, who speaks about race and particularly blackness, is drawing on phenomenology to do so. And Sara Ahmed also writes an article, a very useful article, I use it in my own PhD, called The Phenomenology of Whiteness. So how whiteness feels, right? And so like people are taking that kind of critique and starting to move phenomenology in a direction that is aware of these things. And I'll talk a bit more about it in next section. But yeah, so some of the criticisms that I could find and understand. Another critique that Derrida has is Husserl's commitment to the view of knowledge as necessary, certain, and guaranteed by intuition, right? And so basically he was saying, kind of like I was saying before, that consciousness and experience actually contradict his notions of intuition and being able to do phenomenology. And so Derrida was basically like, what you're trying to do is a very contradictory thing. Is very complicated, but that's the sort of SparkNotes version. Another main criticism of phenomenology is that it claims experience as an origin or source of knowledge and insight. So this starting point then becomes uncritically unexamined. It becomes a precondition of phenomenological thought without ever being questioned. So you're coming from this point of experience without saying, okay, what's beyond that experience? And Sara Ahmed actually does do some interesting stuff with this. Sylvia Stoller, who writes an article actually in defense of phenomenology from some of these critiques, but does outline some of these critiques, says that under this critique, phenomenology is unable to deal with the question of why a particular experience arises at a certain historical moment, kind of like what you were saying with Derrida, right? Like, cannot deal with historicism or why contextually something is happening and why the world is experienced in certain ways by some people and not by others. You know what I mean? So, like, in connection with this, some post-structuralists deem the concept of experience as ahistorical because it imagines experiences to be disconnected from contextually dependent moments in time. Although Stoller states that phenomenology does actually account for historicity of experience.
Yeah, I can see that sort of when you're writing, like, let's say a biography of someone, phenomenology would be like a really integral and almost essential notion to writing about this person and their experiences. But when you're writing a broad cultural history, it's a lot more complicated. Not impossible, but just complicated.
There's also been very harsh critiques that phenomenology is entirely useless as an area of study because phenomena is ultimately too subjective and thus not scientific or able to be empirically calculated. Yeah, it's very science versus humanities vibe.
I mean, you could say that about almost anything.
Yeah, I know. So basically, phenomenology relies quite often on one's own intuition or ability to be introspective. But some people argue against this, especially if you think about modern technology that can actually see people's brainwaves, for example. You can start to empirically understand the way phenomena is experienced. So as a result of these critiques, Husserl's phenomenology, while still influential, is to be used very carefully. I've just noticed that every word is misspelled. There are more critiques based, like the more recent critiques based on the misuse of phenomenology. People like to use it as a buzzword rather than actually doing phenomenological research. And some people claim we should kind of go back to this philosophical, existential, transcendental, hermeneutic roots of phenomenology to counteract that. So just be aware. So queer phenomenology then, which I love, was kind of, I think, coined by Sara Ahmed. So Sara Ahmed writes a book and also an article. So I'm going to put both in the description, but there's also an article that comes out at the same time that is kind of a mini version of the book. So if you don't have time to read a book, you can read that. I do recommend the book, however, because it's just incredible. I love it. So the book comes out in 2006. It's titled Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, and Others. I wanted to discuss this particularly as it offers a good foothold to understand phenomenology in practice for our listeners. We've covered queer theory before. We've covered Sara Ahmed before. You know, we're almost like trained to understand this by now. And if you haven't listened to those episodes, I highly recommend before we kind of get here. But queer theory, briefly, is used to challenge, interrogate, destabilize, subvert a chosen research subject. And so this book takes up the concept of orientation, so that this word, to put queer studies into a closer dialogue with phenomenology. So Sara Ahmed offers an approach of how bodies take shape through tending toward objects that are reachable, which are now available within the bodily horizon. This sounds abstract. I am going to provide some examples, particularly from the introductory chapter and then chapter 1, I believe, which is about objects and orientations, because that is what I use in my own research. And so the book covers orientations and objects, sexual orientation, the orient and disorientation. And so Sara Ahmed does this, I think, quite a few times, taking like a word or a phrase and really developing from that point. So another book of Sara Ahmed's that I think does this is What's the Use? So it takes use and the idea of uselessness, using all this kind of stuff as a point of view to start understanding things. And so this is bringing queerness into context with phenomenology, but Sara Ahmed is also informed in this book by psychoanalysis and Marxism. Sara Ahmed argues that orientation is central to phenomenology because consciousness is always directed towards objects and is always kind of already worldly situated, embodied. And embodiment, it's experienced in the body, right? And so phenomenology, she claims, is very useful because it emphasizes lived experiences of living within a body and intentionality of consciousness, the significance of nearness, and something being near to you. Phenomenology then, for Sara Ahmed, is asking us to be aware of what is around us. If consciousness is intentional, we're kind of not only directed towards objects, but some objects take us in a certain direction. I'll talk about this in a little minute with, I guess, an example being museums, because it's directly from my research. But she says kind of the world has already taken certain shapes as the form of what is more or less familiar. So in the first introduction, she actually critiques Husserl, and she critiques his use of, he basically, I won't talk about the quote because it's very in-depth, but he basically talks about a writing desk and being oriented towards a writing desk and like sitting down in front of paper in front of his writing desk. And she kind of asks, who faces the writing table? Does the table have a face which points towards some bodies rather than others? Again, this sounds quite abstract, but she says, she uses an example of another academic called Adrienne Rich, who's a writer, poet, philosopher, but also a mother. And she says that if you were a mother, then giving attention to objects of writing or facing these objects or facing the writing desk becomes impossible because the children behind you are pulling you away from your attention on your writing. So Husserl's talking about, I think he talks about sitting at a writing desk. He sort of talks about other rooms in the house. He talks about the children outside playing. But she's kind of arguing that Husserl is allowed to sit at that desk and have those experiences because he doesn't necessarily have to go deal with those children, right? Having time for writing, she says, to have time to face the objects on which writing happens, it becomes an orientation that's not available to some and available to others because of your, bringing in the Marxism, your labor of some other attachments that you have to people around you, to things around you, all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and it also doesn't take into consideration how you value time and how you value that desk and value even your own writing and works. So it's not just even about the labor, it's about the emotional labor of you and your work, and then the labor of you and family.
Yeah. Interesting, right? Like taking this phenomenology, this orientation, it's great. So she says we can consider how your background affects what can come into view. So whether that writing desk can even appear for you, right? And Husserl says if phenomenology is to see the table, it's to see it with a natural attitude, right? So he's seeing it from this point of view of like, he makes this claim like only the table remains the same, saying that everything else changes, the table is the same. And she's saying, no, the table isn't the same. It isn't the same for everybody. She quotes Robert Sokolowski saying, quote, when we perceive an object, we do not just have a flow of profiles, a series of impressions in and through them all. We have one and the same object given to us, and the identity of the object is intended and given. So she says that even though the table exists, she can't view it from every single person's viewpoint, right? So this is also complicating. So in the second chapter, which is the thing that I use the most in my PhD, Sara Ahmed provides a really useful phenomenological framework for thinking about orientation in relation to objects. I use this in my research and my PhD will be in by the point this comes out, so I don't mind talking about it. But I use this in my research to talk about the ways in which when you have queer representation of queer and trans representation in a museum, you're oriented in certain ways or not oriented in certain ways are the way you approach the museum, right? If you're a queer person looking for queer representation, you will be often, if the representation is there, oriented to a certain type of way of seeing the object or even having access to that object through that frame of thinking. So if the V&A, for example, puts on the queer tour, you're oriented to a certain epistemological way of seeing that object, right? So the museum is flawed in lots of ways, but it also offers these orientations. So that's how I use it. But she basically says that we first must understand that orientation is not a neutral process and is laden with social and political meaning and structure. orientation is affected by how we've been oriented in the past and how we arrive at the museum with our own, and I'm carrying on with the museum because it's directly from my thesis. So we arrive at the museum with our own histories and experiences that affect how we orient ourselves and how we'll be oriented within the museum. Orientation relies on our perception, and when we perceive an object in a museum, we are oriented towards that object and away from others. This orientation does not just involve objects, but can relate to spaces and individuals as well. So orientations therefore affect how we exist in space and what we do within those spaces. So orientations can be sustained through repetition. We might become used to being oriented towards some objects over others consciously or unconsciously. So she goes on later, by the way, to say that this is how heteronormativity works, right? So the idea that the world or society is almost programmed to persuade you to enter straight relationships. Yeah, so you this is at least on my TikTok, it's a big thing of discussion at the minute. People who are compulsory heterosexual, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily heterosexual always, but they will remain in those relationships or remain straight because they are pushed and oriented towards heterosexuality rather than away from heterosexuality.
Yeah, and like to bring it even closer to your PhD, I think it's what's really fascinating about your work. I'm gonna take this moment to brag about my friend Hannah Ayers. You're, without giving too much away, because I know you have to be really careful about your PhD, but your study set up your participants to purposefully look at things in different perspectives and look at things that you didn't even think about. And being able to not only see how they were looking at objects within the museum, but also explain why they were looking at these objects in that manner within that museum, I think also is a really good visual example of how these things are really complicated and can never be truly just simply be, you are propulsed by this thing, you are moved by this thing. It's like, no, it takes different methods, different instances. Is also like artist orientation. An artist purposefully makes their work in a certain way so that we have an impulse to it. So yeah, once more, when you are able to actually publish your PhD, it's going to be wild, because only then would this comment make sense.
I maybe give an example just to make the point a bit better, but it's a better example with the images, I will say. So where I did one study at the British Museum, and during that study, one of the objects we saw, or like there were two objects put next to each other. There was Roman Emperor Hadrian, and then there was Antinous. I think he was quite young, who he was in love with. And he was in love with this guy to the point where this guy died, also in suspicious circumstances, I will say. He died, potentially was murdered. He made a city called, I think it's called Antinopolis, where he died, like the place where he died. And then he made loads of statues, which is why we have this statue in the British Museum, loads of coins, all this kind of stuff. He poured his grief out into commemorating the existence of this man. And so during the British Museum, like if you go around, you can see these objects, but unless you're like reading one of the labels, you won't really know the extent of their relationship. My participants went and took pictures of Hadrian and Antinous, and they took pictures in such a way that you can see Hadrian is looking up because he's an emperor, he's looking up, and Antinous is looking down. And you can see that one of my participants was like, oh, because one's an emperor and one is, you know, just some guy, him looking up and Antinous looking down gives the impression that one is a top and one is a bottom. So Antinous is the top and Hadrian is the bottom. And they said that it reverses these power dynamics. And again, it's like a funny comment that was made by a participant, but actually the museum, in orienting you towards these objects on a queer tour, it's a desire of identity LGBTQ plus tour, orienting you towards those objects actually allowed for that queerer reading to happen, right? It wouldn't. And I had another participant who called them, was trying to think of what kind of gay tribe these people fit into, like whether it was like otter, bear, that kind of thing. And it's really interesting to see the ways in which museums, for all their flaws, provide these orientations that allow for these readings. Again, some of these readings I would have never even guessed, right? Like one participant took a picture of the ceiling and I was like, why have you done this? But they had a really fascinating and like beautiful, meaningful way of reading that ceiling. But I argue, like, would that reading have occurred had we not been on this tour, had we not been a part of this research that was explicitly queer? And so, orientations, pathways are made easier to follow than others, right? And the availability of certain pathways in the museum makes it easier to allow for a different kind of reading to appear. And so objects and bodies, Sara Ahmed says, gain meaning through their orientation towards one another, and this meaning can affect what orientation takes place in the future. Putting on a tour, or like, for example, the British Museum originally had an exhibition, a very small exhibition. They did a paper trail, and then that led to more and more things, right? The more orientations towards queer and trans reading. Or, one of my other case studies is the Museum of Transology. The Museum of Transology allows for, and is purposefully allowing for, trans readings by trans people rather than medical institutions or legal institutions like what we have for a lot of trans history.
Or even let's tying it back to another episode that we did with Jennifer Evans, which is tying it to images of criminality, and which kind of technically falls under legalese, but it's viewing these images as criminal or evil in some way, and sort of going beyond these specters of, deviance.
Yeah. So this is a way that Sara Ahmed, and I like Sara Ahmed especially because I think her theories, even though rooted in a particular type of understanding, are very applicable. You just have to imagine a way to apply it, right? And so Sara Ahmed is doing phenomenology in practice by talking about orientation, by pinning phenomenology to orientation. It allows for these kind of readings. So I wouldn't say my research is phenomenological, I guess, but I do draw on phenomenology to do this work.
But no, this was fascinating. I feel like I do have a better understanding of it, but it is such a complicated subject that I really do need to possibly just need to read a little bit more just to fully grasp it, because this is a lot.
Yes, yeah, definitely. It's definitely a lot. But I think, I hope that people found this interesting. People found this useful. I hope our less pressured approach to phenomenology, because often you're being, there were other podcasts that I listened to, actually, that I will recommend. Let me recommend them now. So in preparation for this, I listened to an episode on phenomenology by In Our Time Philosophy, but these are philosophers who know what they're talking about, right? And so it feels a bit like insider baseball to listen, and it was fine for me because I've read enough on it that I was like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying. But if you want to understand particularly the ways in which these philosophers and academics deviate from one another, I would recommend that one. And then Theory and Philosophy, another podcast, looked at queer phenomenology specifically. And so I checked my understanding of queer phenomenology by listening to some of that.
And like always, support your local libraries, especially those in the US. You're paying taxes for this. Go to your libraries. Also, they have online resources. Go to your libraries.
Okay, I will stop the recording. Should we say bye?
We can say bye. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.